Hello everyone, my name's Retro, and today I'm going to be doing something a little different. You have no idea just how much I've been dying to talk about Fear and Hunger since I first got into the series. Whether due to lack of confidence or general lack of time, the idea and energy to make a video out of it always managed to evade me. And yes, I know I'm not the first and certainly won't be the last schmuck to do this, but this isn't a theory video or a major lore analysis. No, I just wanted to share everything about this game that just does it for me. I will scream endlessly into the void about my hours upon hours of misery at the hands of this cruel digital world, and it simply would not be enough to describe the absolute adoration I have for it. Because I can promise you that if you open this game, you'll find that it's unlike any other RPG you've ever played before. At least at time of recording. Now, I'm going to have to warn you all of a few things. Firstly, this game was not made for children, if any of you hadn't known that by now. Gore, nudity, suicide, and sexual violence are all commonly referenced and in some cases acted out or encouraged in this game. If any of this sounds like it would be an immediate turnoff, this game is definitely not for you. I won't be covering any of these topics in depth, so keep that in mind when making any purchases. As for the gameplay and lore, it's of my personal belief that this game is best experienced with no prior knowledge of the world, systems, or general aesthetic whatsoever. So if you're the kind of person who likes to play their games blind, click off the video and go watch Markiplier scream at a JPEG or something. All good? Great. Let's go. Published by Happy Paintings in 2018, Fear and Hunger is a grotesque hellspawn birthed into existence by none other than the dark mind of Miro Hävarinen, a Finnish artist who seems to find great fascination in the darker parts of humanity and the human psyche. With how the world's been going, who could blame him? Though, at this point, many of his followers would recognize him by his online handle, Orange. You know, like the fruit. Now, from what I know, the idea for Fear and Hunger came from a pen and paper TTRPG that Miro had developed in his off hours for his college buddies, built entirely off of moral ambiguity and morbid scenarios within the dungeons of Fear and Hunger. Needless to say, the adventures became quite grim. As they played, however, he had the idea of creating something more with this monstrous homebrew system he'd fabricated. Originally created as an art project for his college courses, Miro made Fear and Hunger with less focus on mechanical gameplay and more on the artistic design and overall mood of the dungeons. That's to say, he created it as a piece to be admired and understood. An oppressive fortress, crafted with the sole purpose of evoking a sense of dread and hopelessness in whoever dared to explore it. And of course, being the masochistic humans that we are, we flocked to this almost immediately. The demo for Fear and Hunger, released in 2016, by this point had gained a significant cult following among those with strong enough stomachs for the darker aspects of the game. A following made up of players who could look past the more explicit contents therein. Upon its full release in 2018, the game was praised by fans and some critics for its new, dark, and no-holds-barred approach to the JRPG and survival horror genres. It even garnered enough attention after its full release to encourage the development of a more popular and much higher-budgeted sequel, Fear and Hunger Termina. It's just overall a wonderful time for the people who can withstand the torment. Speaking of torment, let's move on to our second topic. You. Yes, you. Come here. When you start a new game, you're met with 4 characters, 4 different classes, 4 different lifestyles to choose from. The Mercenary, the Knight, the Dark Priest, and the Outlaw. Each of them have their own methods of play, with weaknesses, advantages, and pasts that the player will have to take note of if they're to survive in the sprawl. The first on our list is the Mercenary, a well-rounded choice with endless potential for strength in any direction. Set with an Eastern scimitar, leather drip, and a strange intrinsic ability to make literally everyone horny for his mere existence. Seriously, I looked it up. Of everyone on this list, he has the most posts on Rule 34. Definitely a go-to for newer players who still need to learn the ropes. Set with the ability to flee from most fights without contest, skip key requirements for locked doors or chests, and eventually even start battles with an upper hand. If he manages to survive long enough. Unlike our other options, he also has a chance to start the game with reduced movement speed and still upgrade it later without having to rely on RNG like everyone else. Just try not to get grabbed by any guards before then. The fanbase aren't the only ones after his sweet and supple cheeks. Next, we have the Knight. A more physically aggressive choice. Having the soul of a dummy mommy with incredible defensive abilities, she relies less on wit and more on sheer brawn, combative prowess, and the ability to deny the loss of limbs by perfectly guarding against any sort of oppressive attack the enemy can throw at her. With skills that serve to bolster her own strength and better starting equipment to boot, she's the character one would pick if they sought to dominate the dungeon through sheer force of prowess and strength, kicking the shit out of whatever monsters ended your run previously. Just don't let your confidence get the better of you. Now, the Dark Priest is an enlightened choice for wizard larpers, angsty teens, and grown men who still listen to Blink-182 in the year of our Lord 2023. Jesus, I feel old. Like those people, he similarly possesses zero care or love for those around him. Alongside the ability to throw fireballs, create swirling vortexes of blood magic, and the power to recreate Bug's life with nothing more than a flick of his wrist and a prayer to the Cockroach King. Many a mosh pit has he attended. To answer the burning question you may have, yes, there is a Cockroach King in this game. I have not spoken to him, nor do I wish to. The Dark Priest, in spite of his strength and love for grunge, is also as frail as your average Hikikomori shut-in. He cannot hope to wield anything heavier than a stick or wear anything bulkier than your average pea coat. Suffice to say, his starts tend to be a bit rougher for people who don't know what they're getting into. That's not to say he's impossible for a first-timer, but it certainly won't be easy on them. But, baby, let me tell you, if you like it rough, look no further than our final contestant. Voted most likely to be an anime reference, his strength is rivaled only by his woefully unmatchable sex appeal. The Thugmaster himself. The Outlander. The Outlander is the Omega Chat of the bunch, walking into this dungeon with nothing more than a fur coat and a short bow. He possesses higher strength and damage output, but lacks any sort of specialization in proper combative or contextual skills. Only having picks between turning his enemies into a nice tray of lasagna, or the ability to baby rage against monsters that have greater turn economies than he does. Needless to say, a run with the Outlander is going to be one of torment and masochism. Playing as the Outlander forces the player to combine wit, game knowledge, luck, and combative capability. With no decent skills to fall back on in the early game, it's going to be tough for a new player to pick up this guy without first playing one of the others. But if you can survive the gauntlet that is the first hour, or in some cases 5 minutes, of Fear and Hunger, he'll soon become a force capable of killing enemies without even having to fight them at all. And should you actually manage to pick up any skills or magics on the way, his boosted attack power will make your misery worth the time. Tenfold. Which is another reason why I love this game's choices on characters. No one of them outshines the other in terms of playability, replayability, or, well, drip. Sure, some of them have easier starts, and some of them are loved a bit more than others, but with or without fancy skills, all of them can survive the dungeon in their own fantastic ways. After choosing your character, you'll be met with one of 4 choose-your-own-adventure stories that will determine your starting skills, items, and, if you had the bright idea of playing the mercenary, whether or not you're bringing an STD to the table. Though simple in design, these little opening segments do something that a lot of RPGs, I've noticed, fail to in this day and age. These days, it feels like an RPG will play all of its cards right out the door, or give you choices that don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Then there's the other side of the problem, where they'll overload you with codex entries or journal logs of people who really should have been spending their time finding a bigger sword instead of writing love letters to Kahara in their secret diaries. Now, granted, the latter of those actually do appear in both Fear and Hunger and Fear and Hunger Termina, I think. But unlike in other games, the articles, books, or entries you only might find, and even then will only possibly read in Fear and Hunger, tend to only give a small and sometimes incomprehensible snippet of what's actually going on in the world. It's a bit like, and I hate to make this comparison, but it's a bit like Dark Souls in terms of lore progression and ambiguity. It leaves a lot of room for personal interpretation while still giving you barely enough to understand just how bad things really are. And even still, there's actually a boss I won't spoil that you can use the lore and knowledge from these esoteric books and lore entries to beat. It's simple, effective, and maybe riddled with a few typos. Did I mention this game was made in Finland? Suffice to say, Fear and Hunger manages to craft a strangely effective survival horror experience for an RPG Maker title. On the surface, it seems like your typical Maker horror game, but let me tell you, the game does run a little deeper than Witch's House. Skill trees, a simple crafting system, and its unique limb-based combat system really make for a unique gameplay loop that and I don't think anyone else had ever seen before in Maker games, or maybe even any RPG for that matter. It makes the adventure feel truly different in that regard. That's not even to mention its procedural dungeon, item, and enemy generation systems. I won't say that each playthrough will feel like a fresh experience, because ultimately your goals, possible enemies, and the main premise of the game all remain the same. However, each playthrough will likely encourage, or in some cases force, a player to take a different approach, or embrace skills that they may once have ignored or saw no use in. As skill books and scrolls do not always spawn in the same locations, if at all, the powers gained in each playthrough will generally be different every time around. Though, on the topic of skills and combat, Fear and Hunger manages to effectively combine survival horror aspects with that of your typical JRPG. Think like Silent Hill or the Amnesia series combined with Final Fantasy. As the title suggests, when the player isn't fighting to preserve their tight little behind, they're keeping track of two things: fear and hunger. Like the cooking stream that my viewers will never get, you'll have to make like a master chef and cook up something fierce to keep your never-ending hunger at bay. Moldy bread, cheese, mushroom stew, blueberry pie, a recently born fetus? All of these things have something in common. Today's meal, tomorrow's problem. Now, of course, food is actually an incredibly finite resource in the dungeon. Eventually, you'll have to either delve deeper or just take a risk fighting an enemy and hoping they might have something for you to eat. Or see if they're willing to be a meal themselves. On the other side of the coin is your mind stat. Now, as the common Finlander, your main source of magical energies and overall stability is going to be the odd bottle of scotch, or maybe the occasional handful of opium. Because unfortunately for someone like the Dark Priest, nobody ever goes to the wizard convention without leaving a part of themselves behind. Every grotesque sight witnessed and every spell cast will end up taking a small bit of your mind stat with it. This will force the player to weigh the dangers and potential losses of casting powerful and usually game-changing spells in conjunction with the finite resources and, therefore, time that they possess. Because that's the thing with Fear and Hunger, unlike other survival horror games like Silent Hill or Resident Evil. There is no safe room. There are no breaks in Fear and Hunger. No matter where you are and no matter what you're doing, reading a book, fighting in combat, taking a rest, your hunger and sanity are always ticking away, slowly and endlessly. And if the player is unable to keep their sanity or hunger in check, their strength will slowly dwindle away until they're nothing more than a babbling, blind, maidenless husk of a human being, unable to combat even the simplest of enemies and fearing everything that approaches them. This perfect confluence of thrilling combat and resource management makes for an overall tense and nerve-wracking experience for the first few playthroughs. As I said before, Fear and Hunger boasts a unique limb-based combat system. Your enemies will employ most, if not all, parts of their body for individual attacks. And man, I can't talk about Funger and not bring up its painful yet satisfyingly complex combat. Most enemies you encounter will have arms, legs, a head, torso, and maybe some auxiliary parts. Anyway, most enemies will have arms for beating the piss out of you and legs for dodging and balancing. The player will have to target whichever limb they think will help them in the fight. But ultimately, to kill the enemy, one must attack either the torso or the head. The former being easier to strike, but with higher health. The latter being fragile, but much harder and riskier to hit. So, what will you do? Unfortunately for the player, each limb that their enemies possess bear their own individual attacks. So the odds are always against you and your pitiful single-action economy. Like with everything else in this game, it's going to chew you up like the spit-roasted pork you are. It's hard, but it's still very much possible to challenge, beat, and eventually triumph over this game's complex combat system. And this is why the combat in Fear and Hunger remains my most favorite aspect. It's like a puzzle, figuring out which limb is best to be targeted first, which spells work better on which monster, and what damage types give the best chances. It's like every counter is just a chess match waiting to be won. So don't give up. It's all part of the experience. And this game can be beaten. Just a tidbit though. Unlike the common male, some monsters in this game don't need head to live. Now, if my dear old dad and fellow video essayists have taught me anything, it's that sound design in a horror game can make or break the experience. And in the case of Fear and Hunger... It's a bit hit or miss. For the most part, the sound design in this game is passable. Most of the time it does the job of conveying just what's going on, even with royalty-free files and some that are obviously just a guy whisper screaming into a microphone. But sometimes it can be chunky, buggy, or even just so poorly mixed that it'll blast the eardrums out of anyone playing above 5% volume. That's just for your everyday punches and slashes, though. What really keeps the audio department of Fear and Hunger together are the outstanding scores that blend the tension of combat with the hostility and anxiety of the oppressive dungeon. You might not have realized it, but
most of the tracks
used in today's video can actually be found in the game itself or its sequel. Now, I had originally wanted to only talk about Fear and Hunger Classics music, but with the go-ahead from one of the producers of Termina's wonderful soundtrack, I just can't resist talking about both. Almost all of the music in the Fear and Hunger series has been made by none other than Miro and his friend ChillyMakesMusic, carefully crafted to suit the intensity of whatever environment you crawl through, and whatever beast you have the misfortune of walking upon. Whether it be a blood-drenched hallway or great cathedrals for a grand sacrifice. When they nail the music, they fucking nail it. I mean, seriously, just listen to some of these. A bit tangential here, but something I'd only recently found out is that a fellow content creator by the name of ADarkRaccoon also made a mod to fix some of the broken and glitchy audio files in Fear and Hunger Classic. You know, the ones that'll blast your eardrums out of their sockets. Give that a look if you're wanting a better audio-related experience. Whether the hard-boiled difficulty or deep-seated lore sells anyone in this game or not, Fear and Hunger will remain one of my favorite RPG series of all time, sitting in my top 5 next to Lisa the Painful and Amori, which is why I just felt like I absolutely had to make a video on it, even in the wake of higher brow content creators. I know that this format is much different from what I usually put out, with what little content I put out anyway, but I wanted to try something a little new now that I've finished my migration from Twitch into YouTube proper. I don't expect to make too many of these essays, as this most certainly took a long time to put together, but if you like this brand of content, make sure to like and comment down below. I'll be sure to read them. A big shout out and major thanks to both ADarkRaccoon and ChillyMakesMusic for allowing me to borrow some of their clips and music. It definitely would have taken me a lot longer to find the content and audio for this video if not for them. But if you're wanting more content like this, drop a subscription and consider joining my Discord. It's a mostly barren hellscape at the moment, but you'll get announcements for my YouTube streams and the common vitriol that comes with the territory. Regardless, if you made it this far, I just wanted to say thanks. If my message gets through to even 10 people, this entire video will have been worth it. Because at the end of the day, all I really wanted to do was just talk about this game I love and just keep people smiling. So, make sure you're staying hydrated, make sure you're staying well fed, and make sure you're getting a good night's rest. I'll see you in the dungeons, adventurer.